شلاملخ مريم مليف طيبوثة نارا عماخ مريخات المشي وموريخ بيت خرسريشو ناط مريم يلدت آلها صلح لابين حطاهي هاشا وشاق الموثن آمين.
Donc je suis un diacre français.
Hello, I'm a French deacon who had made plans to become an expert on Middle Age history, and that is why I went to Egypt and was there for over 20 years. It was then that I discovered the people's poverty and I completely changed. For 10 years, I worked as a humanitarian sector in emergency services for people who died of famine. At the end of 10 years, there was another change. I gradually discovered that even the people who need to be nourished the most do not live on bread alone. They also need a reason to live. God Himself is the best reason to live for, of course. Given that in the meantime I had come back to the faith and had had a genuine encounter with Christ, I decided to serve. At first, I served the African Christians that I worked with during those years who lived in poverty and joined Aid to the Church in Need. So when I joined Aid to the Church in Need several miles away from home, which was Czechoslovakia at the time, Father Sakrofale, a Benedictine priest, was murdered for his faith. He died as a martyr. We received the news, but in France, it didn't come out in any of the newspapers. To discover that in the middle of the 20th century, a person could die for his or her faith in a world that seems so free, tolerant, and all of that impacted me a lot. That was the first step in the part of my work because Aid to the Church in Need also works a good deal for suffering churches, situations of poverty, and many other causes. But the suffering particular to the persecution in the early 80s was my special job in Aid to the Church in Need. Then 1989 arrived with an event for the whole world, of course, the end of communism. Perhaps because my first task was as historian, when it happened, I said to myself, we have to find those who remember suffering for the faith. We have to find out about them and their martyrdom, because after a few years, we will probably forget about them completely. So I went to visit Father Berentry, founder of Aid to the Church in Need, who was still the head of the organization. I explained that it was important to me, and he gave me the green light. Later, part of my job consisted of going to every Eastern country, one after the other, to find men and women who had suffered for the Christian faith. Like St. Pope John the 23rd said during the Vatican Council, I believe, we must distinguish between ideologies and men and women. I myself have met wonderful, dedicated people who would have been horrified if they knew what was happening in countries ruled by communism. A massive reality exists, and it's the fact that there is no communist country that has not persecuted people who believe in God. And that is a fact. So, an ideology is one thing, but these are what the facts say. They say that within the ideology, there's something against God and the believer, because you cannot be against God without being against man. In 1989, Pope John Paul II published an apostolic letter on the 50th anniversary of World War II. In that letter, he described Nazism and communism, a branch, a tree fell a long time ago, Nazism. Another one is falling, communism. But the tree still has its roots. What is this tree? Man who makes himself God instead of God. At the heart of communism exists the will of man who wants to take the place that belongs to his Creator alone. This is an aberration because we are God's creatures no matter what we do. Grateful creatures.
toujours Jean-Paul II. Jean-Paul II a été vraiment, je dirais même, le docteur de l'Église.
Yes, John Paul II again is one who has acted as doctor of the church with regards to the role of martyrs in today's world. That's how I was called to work on the Commission of New Martyrs, instituted in 1994 to prepare for the Jubilee. There we tried to follow the steps of this giant to have concrete information. I come back once again to John Paul II. Once he said, "We must not be deaf. We must keep the memories of the martyrs alive. We are destined to. We must conserve them, memories of the martyrs." And he added, "Let us not be deceived. We must keep them alive for our own good." In fact, the martyrs of the faith have done their job. They are with God and with many defenders of the faith. So, what do they tell us about God and what it means to be Christian? They are, and I will go a bit further, bothersome. Perhaps quite bothersome. We see the saints, martyrs, and the early day saints in general, in churches. The Latin Catholics see them in stained glass windows with the sun behind them. It is beautiful. The Orthodox or Eastern Catholics see them in icons with gold, and we think, it's beautiful, it's great to be Christian. Look at the light in the stained glass windows. Finally, we have a little temptation to see them like a child in Madrid who is watching Real Madrid on TV. It's great being a Real Madrid player. Wow, look how good we are. Ronaldo did such and such. He's the best in the world. And the 20th century martyrs, today is more difficult. Why? First, because they are more like us. In the first century martyrs, at best, we know something about their death, but not about their life. How do they concern us? There are 20th century martyrs who have died in genes, like our youth. Not only the youth, but yes, it is getting more difficult. You need a lot of bad faith to say that we do not know anything about the martyrs of this age. Whether they are yesterday's martyrs of communism or the Middle East martyrs of today. But what is happening is that the more we look at our brothers and sisters who died as martyrs or confessors of the faith that I knew, the more we realize that the distance is huge, almost like the distance between Ronaldo and a child in the context of the faith in Christian life. The more we realize that the distance is decreasing. John Paul II stressed this point during the beatification of a nun, Sister Restituta Kafka. For the French, Kafka is a writer, but we also have Sister Restituta Kafka. This sister was beatified shortly before the year 2000 in Vienna, Austria. What had she done in particular? At the beginning, she was very bad-tempered. The sisters used to call her Sister Resoluta, resolute, instead of Restituta, because she was often grumpy and so on. She also talked back to her superior, something which is not right for a religious. Then she went to the hospital that her congregation had in the suburbs of Vienna, Austria, and worked in surgical operations. Of course, it is often difficult with the doctors. When they finished, the doctors would go to have a beer opposite the hospital, and she used to go with them. That time, the sisters still wore their veils, so when they saw a sister outside a cafe with men, it was even worse for this sister. Sister Restituta was afraid of dying. Well, it can happen to anybody in one way or another, but she did not just fear death. She said so too. She told her sisters, "Death scares me." And then she became a saint in the Catholic Church. So, is that why she became a saint? No. During the war in 1942, the police reached this hospital and took all the crosses down and replaced them with swastikas. The next day, Sister Restituta arrived with a cart, took down all the swastikas, and put the Christian crosses back up. She was arrested and beheaded. John Paul II said, summarizing her life very briefly, "When you look at the lives of the martyrs and saints, do not fix your eyes on their death alone. Consider their entire life. If someone would have told the Restituta sisters that one of them would be a saint, they would have said, 'Bah, it will not be her.' Little by little, Sister Restituta's life tended more and more towards Christ. This is why I say that these martyrs, today's witnesses of the faith, are problematic, because they show us that there's no specific way to be Christian. They are not the heroes, and then we do what we can. Oh no. Being Christian is actually the same everywhere."
Alors, il y a un jeu de mots qui paraît un jeu de mots, mais qui est, je pense, très profond.
You asked me if we are also in a kind of persecution. There's a play on words that sounds like a play on words, but I think it is very profound. I do not know which journalist made it up, but it goes, "You cannot talk about gulag in Western countries, but you can talk about mulag, which is mild gulag for us." That is, we cannot talk about violent persecution, but it exists. And in the first place, it is a matter in which the rest of what happened in Europe can open our eyes, because the tendencies, I would say, are the same. I'm going to give you a specific example. One day, a Romanian priest who had spent 14 years in prison after being arrested 3 times for celebrating Mass in the woods, he was a Greek Catholic priest, his church was totally prohibited in times of communism, told me that it is surprising that there are more people in our woods with all of the risks that it implies. Priests could be sent to prison and then to camps, and the faithful could lose their job and then go into problems. There are more people in the woods than in the churches of your places. If there were problems in your places of going to church, the faithful would be a bit more numerous, and even suggested that we make them pay to go to Mass, because he said that if it costs money, then we start thinking about it. If it doesn't cost money, well then, we don't think twice. We choose what's easier. Apparently, it does not cost anything to be a Christian in our societies, like it does for belonging to a club and so on. But actually, if we begin to take the demands of the faith seriously, at work, in the family, and in public, you realize that it is not so easy. In France, with everything that has happened in recent years with social laws that are completely against God's plan and the church's teaching, we have seen that for Christians, the fact of speaking and fighting against those things has brought violent actions on behalf of other sides. Yet once again, in our places in the West, nothing is apparently happening. You can believe in whatever you want, or not believe. There's no problem. Gradually, this is a kind of dissoluteness. While in other countries in the East, if you believe in God, and you said that because of your faith, you can or cannot do certain things. They treat you badly. Things were clear. Once again, I think that these are the same foundations. Man occupies a place that belongs to God alone. For many reasons, and in many ways, I think about Marx and Hegel's thoughts regarding the family. They thought that they had to liquidate the family. In other domains, it is true that the liberal West has had more success than communism. While what someone had done through violence and the other in this sweet or soft way, so to speak, the objective is the same. Once again, as John Paul II said, a branch has fallen, communism, but the tree still has its roots. To be honest, the forms of persecution vary. Saint Therese of Lisieux said one day, I'm quoting by heart, that the forms of persecution against the followers of Jesus Christ change, but what does not change is being Jesus Christ's disciple. The modern forms are, of course, all of these ideologies to replace God with man. But there are also persecutions on behalf of other religions who think they give glory to God by persecuting us. This happens today in the Middle East, as well as India and Southeast Asian and Buddhist countries. So there are very different forms, but what is common to all persecutions, several witnesses have told me this, and it is important, it is not the person or the Christian who is attacked. Above all, it is Jesus who is attacked through that person. Jesus is there. He himself said so, with those who suffer for his name, and we truly realize that. The fact is that there's something in common. Well, I am not only convinced of it, but I am so because I do not think about it before I discovered it. When I began working with the confessors of the faith and martyrdom, there is every possibility you can think of. For example, a 12-year-old boy from Czechoslovakia, several months before his teacher asked, "Who knows the Our Father? Raise your hands." And they called his parents. "You have no right to speak about God to children. Your child will get bad grades and will have problems in school." Also, right after meeting me in Albania, Father Anton Luli, 42 years of detention for the faith, probation, concentration camp, 42 years of detention for the faith. This child's suffering, I remember his name, Peter, and the old priest's suffering were not the same in their duration or torture. Father Luli was nearly crucified one day during Christmas, right when he was fainting in pain. Really atrocious things. The difference of suffering between this 12-year-old boy and this aged priest with over 40 years of prison and camps is great. They were in different countries. Poland was not Albania, and the risks of being a Christian were different. Still, as I interviewed these witnesses, small and large, men and women, clandestine priests, parents, it seemed to me that they always had something in common. The idea that I have kept is like when you sing a song, the words change from one part of the song to another, but the music always repeats itself. So I came to the idea that there was, in the end, music to the witnesses of faith in the persecution. I tried to write this music, about 10 or 15 notes of it, for example, and almost everyone told me that they had given this witness of faith because they had seen others give it to them. Faith is like a virus. God is Lord of the world, and as the means through which he wants to make himself known in the world, he wants his love to be known. He chose what no businessman would have done today, because computers are much more serious than man. He chose to trust in man to make his love known. Faith is like a virus. It is passed on by one's own faith. Almost all of them told me one day, I was brave, whether at school or at work. A priest, when his church was destroyed, had to choose between going to the gulag or saying that he knew nothing about the church, or even in prison, or every day. For 40 years, Father Luli could be freed any day. All he had to do was say, I'm no longer interested in the Catholic Church of God. We can find their faithfulness everywhere. This is one of a dozen reasons. There's also love for the Virgin Mary, prayer, humor. Humor is very surprising. Those men who have suffered so much, I'm speaking for Father Anton Luli, a personality that has struck me. After his liberation at the end of communism, Father Anton went out of his house and saw someone on the street who had tortured him in a disgraceful way. Father Luli said, when I see him, I will go up to him. The man recognized him and crossed the street. So I also crossed the street. He saw me and crossed the street again. Once again, so did I. He could not avoid me. When we met face to face, I took him into my arms and said, I forgive all of you. He did not know where to hide. Voila! Forgiveness is so important. It is truly part of what they contribute, from the heart of what they contribute. Also, with regard to us, Forgiveness is never easy, neither in a religious community or with a married couple. But this forgiveness is Jesus' forgiveness. That is, the forgiveness in which it is the person to whom we have done something wrong who goes first. It is when the one who has suffered goes first. This forgiveness of Jesus's is truly at the heart of what he has given to us, so that if we do not bear witness to it in the world, something essential is going to disappear. When these men and women forgive, their gestures are loving towards those who are going to kill them or make them suffer for several years. There really is something that is part of Jesus' presence among us. Moreover, John Paul II, I always go back to him, says that forgiveness is the greatest sign of love these men and women gave us. I think it goes beyond that. Someone like Father Lully showed the Paschal mystery in a way, because he had been really tortured. His face was just that. It showed that life of suffering he had lived. He was, so to speak, a witness of Good Friday. Yet, this priest's joy when he told me the story of that tormentor and the hug he gave him was the Paschal joy. And not immediately, but a bit later, I thought that it was an Albanese woman, a lot more famous than him, St. Teresa of Calcutta, who told me. The day she won the Nobel Peace Prize, Mother Teresa said, "Today, my church, my Albanian church, has experienced Good Friday. But the Christian faith teaches us that Good Friday does not have the last word. It is not the end, because later Easter comes." These martyrs and confessors of the faith are both witnesses of Jesus' suffering. Jesus suffers his passion in them, and witnesses to the strength of the resurrection and Jesus' power alive in the world. We must never forget that the first Christians called their martyrs martyrs because they were witnesses of the risen Christ's life. First of all, I apologize to all those whom I will not speak about, because all of them struck me. I will say a word about Silboker Shemin, who died just 2 years ago. Yesterday, which is pretty recent, I heard that his friends began his process of beatification in the Slovakian church. This simple man is one of those who have impressed me the most. I won't tell his story because there would be a book or two to tell you about it. I'll tell it briefly. When communism arrived, he did apostolate in his workplace, a public crime. For young workers who preferred Jesus to Marx, it was a political crime. He was sent to the Czechoslovakian gulag for 14 years to extract uranium with his bare hands because he was a doctor in training. When he returned home after all of those years in prison, he could not believe what he saw. When he was arrested, over 80% of the population went to Sunday Mass, young and old. When he went back home, there were only elderly people in the church. It seemed that the persecution was successful and that there were no more young people because it was too risky and no one dared to go. He said, "First, I cried. I said to myself, what is all my suffering and the friends who died in the camps good for, in a church that doesn't have youth and is over?" Then he prayed a simple prayer. He told God, "What is left of my life, if it can help the youth know about you, not against you, but for you, Jesus, I give you my life." And after a few months, the answer came to him in prayer. It was a simple answer, and I will never forget it. We are the complicated ones, not God. The answer was straightforward. How to reach the youth? We couldn't go and talk about God, about Christ, to them at schools and universities because it was not allowed. But not at the cafes and bars. And he started an incredible apostolate. After work, he would go to the cafes next to universities and schools with a beer to talk about the weather and so on. Then he would say, "And what do the religious point of view say?" There, all the youth did the same thing. As soon as he mentioned religion, they became afraid, took their beer, and went somewhere else. He did this 5 times a week for 2 years. Only after 2 years did a young man say, "Oh yes, they do say something." So they did not talk there, of course, because there were other people around. The following Saturday, they went to the mountains, and he spoke to him about God. The young man was afraid. He left and did not come back. But meanwhile, he had talked to a friend, and the friend remained. I'll tell the story quickly. In 1989, at the fall of communism, the movements created by Savoka Shemeri, the young students who afterwards married, had almost 100,000 members. It is the biggest Christian movement in all Eastern Europe. It even has a branch for the disabled. He went to help them all in simplicity. What can we do for Jesus in the world in which we find ourselves? This simple man is also responsible for the events of 1989 in part, because in 1987, John Paul II, who was his friend since he went to secretly visit him when he was in Poland, asked him to go to Rome. The Czechoslovakian government, furious, told him no. It made things difficult for him. The people protested and were beaten by the police. But it was the first time in over 20 years that the people went out in the streets with a rosary and a candle to ask for religious freedom. This man, once again, in a very simple manner, was someone who impressed me a great deal. One last thing about him. The torture he suffered for many years was undescribable. He once told me when I passed by, "In one moment while you're alone, you suffer. And in that moment, the words of the gospel are in you. You no longer exist, but God is greater than all human suffering. It does not matter how great it is. And in that moment, you are happy because you're in God and God is in you." Finally, like I said, there are not two ways to be Christian. Those who suffer and then us, who it would not be hard for us to become members of the Real Madrid, for example. Yet when we reflect for a moment, it has taken me years because I am not very intelligent. The only difference between martyrs and confessors of the faith and ourselves is a violent death and suffering for the faith. Nonetheless, from her birth, the Church has always held that martyrdom is a gift from God, not man's choice. Man accepts it, of course, or can always deny his faith, but martyrdom is fundamentally a grace. In grace's definition, it is not man who decides, rather it is God. So only God is the one who differentiates between martyrs and the rest of Christians. Everything else is exactly the same. Saint Therese of Lisieux says this very well. For them and us, being Christian is the same and always difficult. Even crucifying, we could say. In French, we forget it often, but the word crucify comes from the word cross. Jesus' cross. Living it everywhere is so wonderful. It is always worth following Jesus, whether in risking your life or in the little actions of everyday life. At one stage, St. Therese's sister, who was not in the Carmelite convent, yet she had a dream that Therese died a martyr. She wrote her a letter saying, "You are so lucky," and so on. In general, the more possibilities we have of being martyrs, the more we think we would be good martyrs. This rule is a bit... We have both letters. Therese responds directly. Me? Die a martyr? Today you and I begin to die by needles. That is, we begin to follow Jesus in the little things of every day. This is the greatest lesson the martyrs teach us. This is why I say, and there are texts by John Paul II and popes who follow him and go in this direction, that the martyr is not, in the first place, a model or example because his life is not the same, but it is in the first place a form of grace, a type of sacramental form that Jesus gives to us to encourage us. No situation can make following Jesus not worth it, even if you are an ill-tempered nun like Sister Restituta. Thank you.